Brothers and sisters, elders who have carried the weight of our story, gather close because what I'm about to share is not just another headline, not just another political drama. It is a turning point in the long, unfinished march toward black sovereignty. This time, not over land or chains, but over data, the invisible gold of the 21st century. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while most of the world was still asleep, a young leader in West Africa lit a fire that can no longer be extinguished. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his mission is nothing less than to reclaim the digital destiny of a continent. This story reaches far beyond Burkina Faso. It speaks to every descendant of Africa, in Harlem, in Chicago, in Kingston, who has ever been told that power belongs somewhere else. If these words stir something deep within you, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and share this message with someone who still believes freedom is just a dream. Because today, family, we are going to talk about what freedom looks like when it's written not on paper, but in code. It was not the sound of gunfire that woke the city. It was not the marching of soldiers or the roar of tanks. It was silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while Ouagadougou still slept beneath a pale African dawn, 17 foreign technology companies received the same message. Your operations are hereby suspended by the order of the state. Their gates were sealed. Their servers were seized. Their cables were cut. And their dominance, the invisible hold they had over Africa's future, began to unravel. To the casual observer, it looked like a rebellion against progress. To the untrained eye, it seemed like reckless defiance. But beneath the headlines and diplomatic chatter, something deeper was happening. This was not defiance. This was deliverance. For decades, Africa had been treated as the world's data colony, a vast open field where information was planted, harvested, and shipped away. Every fingerprint stored on a biometric scanner, every phone call routed through a satellite, every online transaction clicked into a server, all of it flowed outward, feeding foreign economies and foreign empires. They told us it was partnership. They told us it was development. They told us it was progress. But the truth, brothers and sisters, is that Africa was being drained, not of gold, not of diamonds, but of something far more precious: memory. And that is why Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose before dawn. Not to start a war of bullets, but a war of bandwidth. Not to claim a colony, but to reclaim a birthright. He knew, as every strategist of the 21st century knows, that the next battles will not be fought on fields of grass or sand, but across invisible networks of code and cloud. He knew that whoever controls the data controls the decisions. And he refused to let Africa remain a spectator in a world where information is power. Thus began Operation Clearsight, a coordinated national strike on foreign-controlled digital infrastructure. By sunrise, foreign networks had gone dark. International traffic routes were severed. Massive data centers, once humming with the pulse of Africa's identity, were silent. But this was only the first move. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré gathered a small team of Burkina Faso engineers, many of them educated abroad, many of them returning home for this very moment. They pored over thousands of classified pages, encrypted financial transfers, corporate contracts, server maps, and surveillance logs. Each document told the same story. Africa's dependence was not accidental, it was architected. It had been designed, built, and maintained to ensure that control would never rest in African hands. It was time to dismantle that design. Within 3 days, Traoré ordered the creation of the National Cybersecurity Center, staffed entirely by Burkina Faso experts. Their mission: to build an independent digital architecture, free from foreign providers, resilient against external pressure. But this revolution was not confined to government buildings or policy papers. It was coming for the classrooms. A nationwide campaign, Notre Avenir, Our Future, swept across television screens and school halls. Teachers spoke of sovereignty not only in terms of territory and law, but in terms of servers and source code. Children began to understand that freedom did not end at the border. It extended deep into the fiber-optic veins of their society. Something profound began to stir in the people. They started to ask new questions. Who owns our data? Who profits from our clicks? Who decides the destiny of our digital lives? And with those questions came an awakening, one not of anger alone, but of purpose. No longer was sovereignty an abstract political concept. It was a living, breathing reality, something that could be touched, coded, and defended. No longer was Africa a passive consumer of technology. It was becoming an author of its own future. But history has taught us that truth, once revealed, always demands a price. And so the world began to ask its own question. One whispered in boardrooms and shouted in foreign capitals. What secrets lay hidden within those seized servers? And who had been listening on the other side of the wire? When the doors of those data centers were pried open, what the Burkina Faso engineers discovered was not just code, it was colonialism rewritten in the language of algorithms. Behind the polished promises of partnership lay a shadow network. Beneath the talk of digital cooperation was a machinery of extraction. Every biometric scan taken in Africa, every financial transaction, every phone location ping, all of it was being funneled silently into servers thousands of miles away. And where did those streams lead? To secretive facilities in Tel Aviv and Paris, not for storage, but for analysis, exploitation, and profit. The revelation hit like a thunderclap across the continent. In the bustling streets of Abidjan, protesters carried placards that read, Nos données, nos droits, our data, our rights. In Dakar, students marched with raised fists, chanting that their identities were not for sale. The myth of benevolent cooperation crumbled in real time. For the first time, ordinary citizens understood that sovereignty was not just about flags and parliaments, it was about servers and silicon. Then came the numbers so devastating they stripped away every last illusion. Investigators revealed that over $2.3 billion in analytical value was siphoned out of Africa every single year through data extraction. Just 10 corporations, headquartered across 5 countries, controlled 32% of all outbound data flows. A staggering 68% of the continent's digital infrastructure was hosted outside Africa, vulnerable to foreign shutdowns. More than 54% of contracts with foreign providers included no transparency clauses about algorithm ownership. And the most damning statistic of all, for every $1 in development aid that entered Africa, $40 left as profit from African data. They lend us 10, Traoré declared in a televised address, and they take back 400. This was no partnership. This was plunder, dressed in the polite language of investment and cooperation. Foreign governments reacted swiftly. Ambassadors from France and Israel demanded explanations, accusing Burkina Faso of violating free market principles. Western media painted Traoré as a reckless populist jeopardizing foreign investment. Economic analysts warned of isolation, stagnation, even a digital dark age on the continent. But the young captain remained unshaken. His reply was measured, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. We are not closing the doors of commerce. We are closing the leaks in our sovereignty. That single sentence ignited the internet. Hashtags like Data Power and Afrique Réveillez-toi, Africa, Wake Up, swept through social media platforms, trending from Lagos to London. The digital war cry was no longer confined to politicians or activists. It was now on the lips of ordinary Africans, taxi drivers, teachers, farmers, all demanding control over the invisible wealth that shaped their futures. The international community grew nervous. Western officials warned that restricting data flows could set Africa back decades. Think tanks released reports insisting that openness was the path to innovation. Yet critics across the global south fired back with a piercing question. If openness truly fuels innovation, why, after 2 decades of open cooperation, has no African company broken into the top 10 global tech firms? The moral ground beneath the old arguments was crumbling. In the midst of the storm, Traoré and his allies took the next step. Representatives from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Ghana, and Senegal met in Addis Ababa for an emergency summit. There they drafted and signed the Continental Data Sovereignty Accord, a historic treaty whose first article was just 8 words long. Africa's data must remain in Africa. It was a line drawn in digital sand, a declaration that the era of silent extraction was over. Western capitals labeled it cyber nationalism. Editorial boards warned of a splintered internet. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Accra, the reaction was very different. People danced. They sang. They embraced one another. Because this was not just a policy, it was a proclamation. Africa was no longer a passive participant in its digital destiny. It was now the author of it. And yet amid the celebration, a sobering thought lingered. Treaties are words on paper. They mean nothing unless they are tested. And the test was coming. In the markets, in the boardrooms, in the back channels of global diplomacy. Would the world accept Africa's demand to own its future? Or would it try to crush this digital uprising before it could take root? The battle lines were drawn, and the first shots of the data war had been fired. What began as a bold act in one small nation soon grew into a wave that no border could contain. The decision taken in Ouagadougou did not remain a domestic affair. It became a continental awakening. Inside Burkina Faso, the transformation was immediate and visible. Foreign analysts had warned of collapse, of chaos, of a technological vacuum that would cripple the nation. But instead of darkness, there was light. Instead of silence, there was innovation. The void left by departing multinational corporations became fertile ground for homegrown creation. Startups, once tethered to foreign servers, now found themselves free to build and grow. The state, once a silent bystander in the digital economy, became its greatest champion. Tax incentives appeared. A $120 million innovation fund was launched to seed local enterprises. Free server space was provided to Burkinabe businesses ready to host their operations domestically. Within 12 months, the number of national tech companies doubled. An industry once dominated 80% by foreign hands was now proudly majority African-owned. But the revolution extended beyond the market. It seeped into the classroom, into the home, into the hearts of the people. In schools, the curriculum shifted. Children were no longer passive users of imported apps. They were builders of new ones. Teachers spoke of sovereignty not just in terms of land and law, but in terms of data and design. Students learned that the future was not something to be downloaded. It was something to be written. In village meetings and city squares, elders spoke about servers and encryption keys with the same gravity they once reserved for borders and constitutions. The vocabulary of sovereignty was expanding, and the people were expanding with it. The tremors were felt across the Sahel. One by one, neighboring nations began to act. Mali, Niger, and Guinea launched full audits of their cloud contracts, uncovering hidden clauses and reclaiming control over their digital infrastructure. Ghana suspended a $220 million deal with an Israeli technology company after discovering a lack of algorithmic transparency. And then came the institutions. The African Union, long hesitant to enter the digital debate, passed a historic resolution declaring data a strategic national asset. Universities in Nairobi and Lagos created faculties dedicated entirely to cyber sovereignty, training a generation of engineers, lawyers, and policymakers equipped for this new era. But perhaps the most powerful change was not institutional. It was emotional. It was spiritual. In Revolution Square, thousands of people gathered one evening. They held their phones high, screens glowing like candles in a vigil. The air was alive with song, not just national anthems, but chants of defiance and hope. They took our mines. They took our ports. They took our railways, the crowd thundered in unison. But they will never take our code. It was not a protest, it was a declaration. For the first time, ordinary Africans were speaking of data with the same reverence they once spoke of gold or land. They were beginning to understand that the future wealth of their nations would not come from beneath the soil, but from within the server. And yet, even as Africa celebrated, the ripples reached far beyond the continent. The CFA franc dipped slightly. Western investors, uncertain of the new environment, hesitated. Think tanks in Europe and the United States warned of a digital Cold War that could isolate Africa from the global economy. But the collapse never came. In its place, something unexpected rose: African solidarity. Companies from Kenya and Nigeria offered their expertise to strengthen Burkina Faso's new systems. Regional coalitions formed to build shared data infrastructure. Private investors from across the global south began pouring money into African cloud and AI ventures. A new term began to circulate among analysts: the Ouagadougou effect. The idea that a single courageous act by a small state could realign the balance of global power. They compared it to the founding of OPEC, when nations that once sold their oil for pennies learned to dictate the price of their own resources. But this time, the resource was not physical. It was digital. It was invisible. And it was worth far more. The consequences were not merely political or economic. They were existential. For the first time, Africans were asking a question that cut to the heart of their identity. If we do not own our data, do we truly own ourselves? This question spread like gospel, from classrooms to churches, from markets to ministries. And it reached across the Atlantic too, resonating with Black communities in America, the Caribbean, and Europe who had long known what it meant to have their labor, their culture, and their genius exploited for someone else's gain. Comment prompt: where do you draw the line between openness and ownership? In your own life, who holds the keys to your digital identity? But the world does not surrender power easily. As 6 nations stood together under the banner of data sovereignty, the empires that once controlled their information were preparing to fight back, not with armies, but with markets, misinformation, and manipulation. The question was no longer whether Africa could rise. The question was whether it could stay standing when the winds of retaliation began to blow. The shockwaves from Ouagadougou did not end at Africa's shoreline. They rolled across oceans, unsettling the boardrooms of Wall Street, the halls of Brussels, and the corridors of Washington. Suddenly, a new fault line had appeared, one that split the digital world into 2 competing visions. On one side stood the defenders of the old order, Western governments and corporate giants preaching the gospel of openness. Their message was simple: the free flow of data fuels innovation, growth, and progress. Any attempt to restrict it, they warned, would plunge Africa into isolation, cut it off from investment, and push it decades behind the digital curve. On the other side stood a new and rising coalition: African leaders, scholars, engineers, and everyday citizens, declaring that openness without ownership is just dependency by another name. If sovereignty means anything, they argued, it must include the right to decide where your data lives, who uses it, and for whose benefit it works. The clash was not merely technical. It was philosophical, a struggle over who gets to define freedom in the digital age. And the comparisons were impossible to ignore. Nations like China, India, and even the European Union had all implemented strict data localization laws. Their digital ecosystems didn't wither, they flourished. By keeping value creation within their borders, they built tech giants, protected their citizens' privacy, and safeguarded national interests. If the global north could do it, why not Africa? But this story carried a deeper resonance for Black America, especially for elders who had lived through the civil rights era. It echoed a truth they had always known: power without ownership is an illusion. From the days of Freedmen's Bank, when black wealth was stolen under the guise of progress, to the destruction of Black Wall Street when self-sufficiency was seen as a threat, the lesson has always been the same. Freedom is not given. It is built. And it is built on control. Control of land, of institutions, of narrative, and now of data. For many in the diaspora, Ibrahim Traoré's stand was more than geopolitics. It was a sermon in action. It reminded them of the power of self-reliance preached from pulpits during the civil rights movement. It echoed the warnings of Malcolm X. Only a fool would let his enemy educate his children. Today, that same fool would let his enemy own his information. This moment opened the door to a new kind of solidarity, one that transcends geography and generations. Black churches in Atlanta could partner with universities in Accra to train data scientists. Community foundations in Chicago could fund African cybersecurity labs. Retired engineers in Washington could mentor young coders in Ouagadougou. This was more than foreign policy. It was family business, a chance for a scattered people to write a new chapter together. But as history has taught us, no empire surrenders quietly. And as the debate raged, one question began to loom large over both sides of the Atlantic. If sovereignty can be coded, can solidarity be coded too? The story is not finished. History, as every elder in this room knows, is not a straight line. It is a river, bending, splitting, and sometimes flooding its banks. And the river that began in Ouagadougou is now flowing toward three very different futures. The first path is the cautious one, the path of steady consolidation. In this scenario, Burkina Faso and its allies strengthen their digital sovereignty step by step. They harmonize data laws, create shared regulations, and sign intra-African data exchange agreements to ensure that information circulates within the continent instead of flowing outward. An OPEC of data is born, a coordinated bloc that sets standards, negotiates with global tech powers, and protects Africa's digital wealth. Growth remains stable, averaging around 38%, and a powerful independent internal market emerges. The second path is the radiant one, the path of renaissance. Here, the example set by Ibrahim Traoré inspires a global wave. Nations in Latin America and Southeast Asia follow suit, adopting their own data sovereignty frameworks. Investors from Asia pour billions into African cloud infrastructure. Local tech companies become exporters of innovation rather than mere consumers. Africa's digital GDP surges by more than 60% in 5 years. In this future, Traoré is remembered not just as a national leader, but as the catalyst for a global movement, the architect of a digital decolonization that reshaped the 21st century. The third path is the shadowed one, the path of resistance and retaliation. Here, the old powers fight back. Economic pressure mounts. Misinformation campaigns sow confusion. Development aid is tied to demands for data openness. Some African elites, seduced or coerced, might break ranks. The continent risks fragmentation, split between zones of sovereignty and zones of foreign control. And yet, even in this darker vision, the seed planted in Ouagadougou does not die. It goes underground, waiting for the next generation to bring it back into the light. Whichever path Africa chooses, one thing is clear: sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a system. It is not a chant shouted in the streets. It is an architecture built piece by piece. And that architecture is already taking shape. The 5-step plan announced by Traoré is not theory. It is blueprint. Map all internal and external data flows. Build the Bouclier Sahel, a network of regional cybersecurity centers. Train 10,000 African engineers in cryptography, cloud technology, and ethical AI. Produce local servers, cables, and open-source African software. Audit progress every 6 months to measure growth and close the gaps. But this struggle is not Africa's alone. It is a call to the entire African world, to the diaspora, to the elders, to the dreamers scattered across the Atlantic. Because the code that will secure Africa's future is not written only in Ouagadougou. It is written in Atlanta, Baltimore, London, and Kingston, wherever African hands and African minds choose to write it. Brothers and sisters, this is where you come in. You who have marched, you who have built, you who have endured, your wisdom is needed again. Mentor a young coder. Fund a scholarship. Connect a black church in the U.S. with a tech hub in Ghana. This is our generation's Montgomery bus boycott. This is our Selma. But instead of bridges and buses, we are crossing firewalls and fiber optics. Because the truth is this: tomorrow's borders will not be walls of stone. They will be covenants of code. And the question before us is not whether they will exist, but whether our names will be written into them. The story of Africa's digital destiny is still being written, and whether we sign our names in its code will decide if we are remembered as spectators or as ancestors. And so, beloved, we stand at the edge of a new era. An era where power is no longer measured by the size of an army or the depth of a mine, but by the control of data, by the ownership of memory, by the authority over our own digital selves. For centuries, Africa's story was written by others, carved into treaties she did not sign, recorded in archives she did not own. They took the gold beneath her soil. They took the oil from her ground. They took her sons and daughters across oceans. And even now, they seek to take her future. One line of code, one stolen data set, one invisible algorithm at a time. But the tide is turning. What began as Ibrahim Traoré news has become something far greater, a continental awakening, a generational reckoning. Burkina Faso has shown that dignity is not a gift to be granted, it is a right to be claimed. It has shown that sovereignty is not just about borders drawn on a map, but about the invisible boundaries we draw around our identity, our information, our destiny. And this fight, this sacred, necessary fight, is not Africa's alone. It belongs to every child of the diaspora, to every elder who has carried the weight of injustice, to every ancestor whose name was stripped from a ledger and replaced by a number. It belongs to those who built without owning, who worked without profiting, who dreamed without seeing the harvest. Today we are called to finish what they began, to turn protest into policy, to transform memory into movement, to build a future where Burkina Faso news is not a story of struggle, but a story of strength. So I ask you, brothers and sisters, if you could rewrite the contract of our digital lives, what clause would you add to protect your grandchildren's tomorrow? Share it in the comments. Speak it into the world. Because silence is the ally of exploitation, but testimony, your testimony, is the seed of liberation. Subscribe. Share this message. Pass it forward. Because Ibrahim Traoré news is not just a headline. It is a reminder that we are still writing history, and this time, we write it in our own language, with our own code, and under our own name. They took the mines. They took the ports. But this time, they will not take the code.